TV.com, we have a link to the FBI website. For those who work in the Navy complexes here in Western Washington, a reminder, the Department of Defense still under protection condition Delta. That's the highest level of alert for all military installations. Until that condition is lifted, only essential personnel are to report to Navy Region Northwest installations. The condition applies to both active duty and civilian personnel. Those who are to report to work are being encouraged to use public transit or carpools. So many precautions being taken. Here are some of the closures and reopenings that we're aware of so far. Sports schedules are impacted. The Washington Huskies game scheduled at Miami this Saturday, postponed. All Major League Baseball games were canceled. No word yet on when the Mariners will resume play. Financial markets remain closed tomorrow, but many local shopping centers, which were closed today, will reopen tomorrow. The Bank of America Tower will be open for business tomorrow. So will the Convention Center, the ferry system up and running, and tonight's symphony performance will take place tomorrow night. Most of us woke up to today's incomprehensible news. It was just before 6 a.m. when the first plane crashed into the Trade Center. KOMO's Greg Todd joins us now live with a look at how the people of Seattle and the Northwest are reacting to this terrible tragedy. Greg?
Kathy, I've never heard the city so quiet. Normally, up above, there's a nearly continuous sound of aircraft. Now, the sky is silent. And everywhere we've gone tonight to talk with people, they're talking in quite somber tones and all talking about the attack. In Seattle, there is an eerie quietness from the empty sky devoid of aircraft to the streets below. Even the newspaper hawker is silent. Everyone knows the news, and it's still hard to comprehend.
It's just hard to imagine that it can happen in our country.
These men came to Seattle from separate corners of the nation for training classes that were suspended because of the tragedy.
How do you sit in class and talk about lesson and stuff like that while, some of us are trying to figure out if, friends and family back east are still there?
And they all donated blood, not knowing what to do, but wanting to do something.
All morning long, we walked around like zombies, just in total disbelief. And now I think there's a little bit of anger setting in also.
In West Seattle, Nathan Larson and his neighbor put out flags as symbols of patriotism and out of respect for the lives lost.
It's just a sad day, life is precious.
At Alki Point, a replica of New York's Statue of Liberty is draped in a flag. Carl Bernick never thought he would live to see a day he could compare to Pearl Harbor.
The events of this morning kind of make that pale in my memory. I thought that was the worst thing that ever happened to this country. But
Paul Mullen hopes somehow the violence will end.
And I just want it stopped, and I don't know how it can actually be stopped. It's going to do no good to go back over there and bomb the people over there. It's doing exactly the same thing, in my opinion.
People not knowing what else to do bring flowers to Alki Beach, while offshore, the USS Rodney M. Davis patrols on alert, guarding the entrance to Elliott Bay. And in the darkness across Elliott Bay right now, the Davis is still there, one of 3 Navy ships patrolling in Puget Sound tonight, seeing no threats and assuring that Western Washington remains safe. And atop the Space Needle, our country's flag flies in the Millennium Light. Reporting live from downtown Seattle, Greg Todd, KOMO 4 News.
Thank you, Greg. Today's events have generated some pretty powerful emotions. Tonight, local experts are reminding us you don't have to deal with them alone. If you can, they say, watch television coverage with someone and talk about what you're feeling. Know that all those emotions, crying, anger, fear, are normal responses to abnormal events like today's. And crisis experts say try to keep your daily activities as normal as possible. If you have children in your life, you'll want to help them through this crisis too. Here's some advice from the Seattle Crisis Clinic.
Answer questions simply and honestly, and do encourage the questions if the child is feeling like they want to know more about it. And again, keep the answers simple and on their level.
McDaniel also suggests helping children identify their feelings and offer physical comfort. Give your children an extra hug. Now, the economic impact from all of this. The attack on the World Trade Center just blocks from Wall Street had an immediate effect on money markets worldwide. Europe's and Japan's stock markets both fell to lows they haven't seen in 3 years. Insurers and airlines took the biggest hit. The U.S. dollar fell sharply against the euro and the yen as some investors lost confidence in the United States as a safe haven. And oil prices surged nearly $2 a barrel. And now we know U.S. markets will stay closed at least through tomorrow. Within hours of the terrorist attacks, gas prices skyrocketed in some parts of the country. But so far that isn't happening in the Puget Sound area. The lines have been long at some local pumps, but the cost for gasoline so far remains steady here. Big oil companies say they are freezing prices and promising to keep distribution flowing. The attack certainly has touched us all, especially younger generations who've never experienced the horrors of war. At Seattle's Garfield High School, Como's Amy Schaefer sat in on a class struggling to understand this tragedy.
At Garfield High School, somber faces spent lunchtime glued to a television.
Obviously, the crash into the building.
And class time asking questions.
If you're saying that there's a gun to his head, the pilot, then how did the gun get past there? And how did 7 terrorists get on these planes? It's so scary.
Think about the planning it takes and all that stuff. And I know it's a surprise, but I'm amazed that they didn't have any sort of idea of what was going on.
I think the terrifying thing at this point is how much we don't know. I mean, we don't know who did it, we don't know why they did it, we don't know anything.
They only know about Pearl Harbor through their history books. This will be the Pearl Harbor of their generation, a generation that has never known war.
What are our options as a country to respond?
Why do we necessarily have to use violence or fight back? Why? There has to be some other solution.
How can we not fight back? We have to. We can't just let them get away with themselves.
Going on what we know now, violence is basically the only language they understand. They came in here with planes and ran it into a building and killed 50,000 people. We're not just going to put up a sign that says, please don't do this anymore.
They wish it were that simple.
Probably the largest problem for this was the false sense of security that we have, And we didn't expect this, but the doors were wide open, And now, here we are sitting in a classroom talking about it. It's reactionary, and we're, just reacting to what happened instead of thinking about the possibility of it happening before.
But they know what happened before no longer matters, because tomorrow will never be the same. In Seattle, Amy Schaefer, Como 4 News.
There was also a bit of a scare in the skies above Canada today. A Korean Airlines jet heading to Anchorage from Korea was forced to land in the tiny town of Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory by U.S. and Canadian Air Force jets. It was suspected that the plane was being hijacked, but that was not the case. The plane was having some sort of fuel emergency and had changed its flight plan. At the top of the list of suspects in today's devastating attacks is Saudi billionaire Osama bin Laden. But Muslims here in Seattle want the city to know they do not condone the violence. St. James Cathedral in Seattle sponsored an interfaith service tonight. People of all races came together to show support for the victims.
Today's tragic event affects all of us in one way or another.
In a statement issued today, local Muslim representatives also said we condemn in the strongest terms possible what are apparently vicious and cowardly acts of terrorism against innocent civilians. We join with all Americans in calling for the swift apprehension and punishment of the perpetrators. No cause could ever be assisted by such immoral acts. Now, you may be wondering what you can do to help out. Get a pen, we have some information for you. As Como's Leslie Knopp reports, many people from the Northwest are helping out, sending their skills, even their thoughts, back east.
They are on their way back east. 62 members of Puget Sound area urban search and rescue departments and fire departments flown east from McCord.
They don't need our sympathy, they need our help.
And help from people who care comes in many forms and from anyone. These people were willing to wait up to 4 hours at Seattle blood banks to donate.
We saw a man fall out a window on TV. It was, the whole thing is just really insane.
Right now, there's no feeling right now. It's horrible, just horrible.
feel like they're helping in some way, and small way, but hopefully this will help.
About the extensive loss of life that has occurred.
And it did help, actually, in a big way. Normally, 700 people a day donate in Seattle. This day, it was closer to 2,000.
I'm downtown every day, and I'm generally up in a big building, and I can't imagine, you know, the horror that many of those people felt. But I do know that we need to participate.
And there are many ways to participate. Here's how you can reach the Red Cross. You can call for an appointment to donate. More blood is needed, or you can donate money. Como's People Helper will also take donations and forward them to the Red Cross specifically for food and shelter for those forced to evacuate in New York. People also made other suggestions they wanted us to pass along, ways to help that are less concrete, but perhaps symbolically as important. Fly the American flag and send your thoughts and prayers to the victims and their families. In Seattle, Leslie Knopp, Como 4 News.
We've also learned that Washington Mutual Bank is giving $250,000 to the Red Cross for disaster relief. So already local businesses are responding. Among those, Seattle-based Amazon.com. The main page, their homepage on their website, is devoted to encouraging people to donate to the Red Cross. And at last count, we're told that more than $130,000 has been raised on the website as people try to in some way help. Now, Todd Johnson is here. We're going to take a quick break from the news of the day because we realize many of you haven't seen a local weather forecast today, and you might be wondering, you know, how do I send the kids out to school tomorrow? What can I expect? So give us the thumbnail version.
Well, we're fortunate that the weather's going to stay pretty calm around here. We've been enjoying some beautiful conditions the last few days, and this evening, for the most part, skies are relatively clear. I want to give you a peek outside right now. Our live ComoCam view looking out across downtown Seattle now, and for the most part, yes, skies are clear. Now, the temperatures this evening are going to cool off a little bit. We'll have overnight lows looking a little something like this: 55 degrees for Seattle, 48 in Bellingham, down to 46 in Olympia. Tomorrow, more sunshine in the forecast, high temperatures, low to mid 70s, 75 degrees for Seattle. Tacoma and Kent are going to top out right around 76. And as you look at the 6-day planner, you'll see that there is going to be a little bit of fog on Thursday morning. Then we'll clear out through the afternoon, more sunshine for Friday and the beginning of the weekend. Then a few changes coming as the clouds start to build in late on Sunday. And I do think for the first time in a while, we'll see some rain, but not until the early part of next week.
All right. Good. Thanks, Todd. Well, it certainly has been a difficult and overwhelming day for Americans. New information is continuing to unfold. Those rescue efforts are continuing with some desperation. And as we learn new information, you can count on Como 4 News and ABC to keep you up to date on the air and online. So from all of us here at Como 4 News, we want to thank you for being with us today. We hope you know we will be here throughout the night and, of course, through the day tomorrow. In the meantime, we want to leave you with continuing coverage live from ABC in New York. Thanks for being here.
Able to be evacuated after the first jet slammed into the first tower. At the Pentagon, officials fear hundreds were killed when another hijacked jetliner struck there. The military is responding by putting its forces all over the world on the very highest alert, and an aircraft carrier due to come home from the Persian Gulf has been ordered to remain in the area indefinitely. We are now going to go to we're going to Bill Blakemore, who is down at the ground zero where the crews are working so diligently, so hard to try and find any victims, any survivors. Bill, what kind of progress are they making?
We haven't heard of any other than 2 or 3 people being pulled from the rubble so far. There have been a number of the search and rescue workers who've worked their way back up here after their shift ended, covered with dust, who've talked about how depressing it is to try to dig through 10 feet of ash and rubble and then just find another bit of metal and then have to start all over again, finding nothing. The really sobering thought, of course, Elizabeth, is the fact that down there at the end of the street is where all of the bodies are lying. We don't know how many it is that people are saying could be in the tens of thousands.
This can often be a very delicate task in cases like this. The wreckage itself could collapse at any moment. How difficult a job is this, and how hard is it to even get close to some of this wreckage?
Well, first of all, a couple of buildings around the edge of it are still burning, and we can see some of the smoke still piling up from from some of those fires. Some of that, of course, is also dust from some of the demolition work as they're trying to get some of the debris cleared away. So they've got that difficulty. They've also got the difficulty of the fact that the trade towers seem to have completely disintegrated, virtually completely disintegrated as they fell down upon themselves. There's almost nothing left of any of the floors. So they have a great density of wreckage as well.
All right, Bill Blakemore, thank you so much for that update down at Ground Zero at what was the World Trade Centers and what is now the scene of a massive crime scene and a terrible national tragedy. Members of Congress were briefed on the very latest developments last night, and ABC's Barry Seraphin joins us now from Washington. Barry, I assume they know more than we do at this point.
They certainly do, Elizabeth, but at this point, there's no definite finger pointing, but they're being told the same thing we've been hearing, that many things at this point point to Osama bin Laden. Members of Congress tonight, like the President, expressed resolve and determination to find and punish those responsible, and determination that freedom will prevail. Tomorrow, to back all that up, Congress will adopt a resolution which will support the President and also denounce these terrorist acts. Congressional leaders are expected to meet with the President tomorrow morning. And there's some talk in coming days of a joint session of Congress, perhaps addressed by the President.
Indeed, we've heard so many members of Congress, the President himself, members of his administration talk about the importance of sending the message that it's going to take a heck of a lot more to stop the United States government from operating. But tomorrow, when they do go on to, when they are meeting and getting these briefings, what can they legitimately hope to accomplish? I mean, the Pentagon is burning, and then obviously we don't have a lot of information yet on who is responsible for the attack. So Barry, what is this more symbolic, the business they have planned tomorrow? Yeah,
it's certainly meant to send a message, Elizabeth. Exactly that the government is still functioning, that the U.S. is still standing. And it's also true that that's one of the reasons that government agencies will be back open tomorrow, even the Pentagon. But they won't be operating probably at full strength, and we still have a state of emergency here. We have National Guardsmen, 300 of them in the District of Columbia, 300 more in Virginia, and by the way, about 3,000 of them by later today in New York, which will be patrolling streets, keeping security, keeping traffic moving, and maintaining a presence.
We have a look already, Barry, at the first headlines of the morning newspaper from the Washington Post. I believe we have a graphic, or can we get that up there? No, I guess we don't. We'll be getting that. There it is. Terrorists hijacked 4 airliners, 2 destroy World Trade Center, 1 hits Pentagon, 4th crashes. That 4th jet, of course, referring to the United Airlines jet that crashed in Pennsylvania. This has got to be a surreal evening there as well, Barry. I mean, we had members of Congress momentarily evacuated. Obviously, the President hopscotching around the country in search of safe haven as well as information. Finally, everybody converging back on the Capitol tonight. It must be equally surreal there.
It was an eerie day here, Elizabeth. You know, in a way, it looked like the city looks like during a blizzard. This morning, traffic was choking the streets because other streets had been closed off around sensitive buildings. But for most of the afternoon, the city was just empty, just quiet, except for police and the occasional siren. And tonight, it's much the same way. This is clearly still a city in shock.
All right, Barry Seraphin in Washington, D.C. The same could be said as well for New York City, where the streets are practically deserted. It's something very unusual in the city that never sleeps. Very little traffic. People are basically being told by the mayor here to stay inside, to stay close to information, to not come down if they can avoid it at all costs. But back in the Capitol, on Capitol Hill steps just last night, members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, stood side by side, said they will stand as Americans together to condemn the attacks and support retaliation. They then did something very unusual and joined together in a patriotic song. Let's take a look.
Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean, wide with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
We can see there a symbolic gesture by members of Congress standing together to sing a song of patriotism to show that they are, in fact, standing together, united in this against this attack. To recap, 4 commercial jetliners, 2 United Airlines jets, 2 American Airlines jets, 757s, 767s, in a well-coordinated terrorist attack hijacked this morning. 2 of the jetliners crashing into the 2 twin towers in New York City. Those twin towers then collapsing about an hour later. Shortly afterwards, massive casualties are expected. It could be weeks before we know how many people might have been killed or injured in that attack. As well, another jetliner crashed into the Pentagon. And again, there we expect to hear about hundreds of casualties as well. A 4th jet crashed in the countryside in Pennsylvania. It is believed that that jet, the hijackers on board that jet, were aiming for Camp David. But as of now, the massive rescue and search efforts are going on down in New York City at the base of this island. It is complete chaos down there, as we've been able to see from our cameras on the scene. They are hoping to find survivors. As of now, so far, only a small handful. And again, rescuers have been working around the clock. Among those feared killed in this explosion, in this terrorist attack, were over 300 New York City firefighters who were in the process of trying to evacuate one of those 2 twin towers. Also, several police officers, many of the top brass of the fire department, were on the scene at the time that the towers collapsed after the jets had crashed into them, and they are feared dead as well. This is a devastating, obviously, terrorist attack. President Bush took to the airwaves a few hours ago, vowing to find who is responsible and vowing swift and strong retaliation. So once again, this is ABC News continuing coverage of the terrorist attacks on the United States. And as we've been saying, that difficult and grisly task of searching for bodies and survivors is intensifying at the site of the World Trade Center. Many of the victims are buried beneath the rubble of the twin 110-story towers. They collapsed yesterday, right after those jetliners slammed into them. Cameras did capture that horrifying moment when the second of those 2 jets crashed into the tower and burst into flames. Again, a terrible, terrible sight. Some 50,000 people normally work at the World Trade Center every day. We have no idea how many people were actually in the towers at the time of those 2 explosions that you're looking at right now. Officials say determining a final death toll could, in fact, take weeks. Again, at the Pentagon, still recapping, officials fear hundreds were killed when another hijacked jetliner struck there. The military is responding by putting its forces around the world on the highest state of alert. There has been no credible claim of responsibility yet for any of these attacks, but federal authorities have identified suspected terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden as a prime suspect. He has vowed to do devastation, to wreak havoc on the United States in the past, and this was clearly as a stunningly well-orchestrated terrorist attack. 4 hijackings happening in the span of 2 hours or 1 hour this morning, and many law enforcement officials still struggling to figure out how this all happened. We can go now to ABC's Josh Gerstein, who is in Washington, D.C. Josh, the President, Congress all showing a united front and vowing that business will continue and swift revenge.
Well, they certainly are vowing swift revenge and a return to normalcy, but it was anything but a normal day for President Bush. He began his day in Sarasota, Florida at an education event, a fairly routine event for the president, when he first got word of the first plane crashing into the World Trade Center. And then when the second plane went into the World Trade Center buildings, it became clear to everyone that this was no accident. This was a terrorist attack. And then, of course, word of the attack on the Pentagon and the other planes going down. The president spent the day hopscotching, going around the country, very, very unusual. He took off out of Sarasota, Florida, after making a few brief remarks, flew to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, was there for some time, had a meeting, had a conference call from the general's quarters there at Barksdale Air Force Base, then got back on Air Force One under very tight security and flew on from there to Nebraska, Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, which is a base that was intended for use during the Cold War as a hideout in the event of a nuclear doomsday. He landed at Offutt Air Force Base and went into a very, very small building, which we're told allowed him to descend into an underground bunker where he held a full national security meeting with officials back here in Washington. And at that point, he then returned returned, flew back to Washington. His advisors very eager to get him back here to show that the government was trying to return to normal. And indeed, this evening, things returned somewhat to normal at the White House after being evacuated for most of the day. The White House staff was allowed back in, and the press was allowed back in this evening, although they have now closed the White House for the night. It's right behind me, and they've turned the lights off, but they say they will be back in business first thing in the morning.
And that is reassuring. All right, Josh Gerstein, thank you so much for that report. In a speech from the Oval Office, Mr. Bush sought to calm a country shaken by unprecedented violence. Let's listen.
Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
President Bush speaking from the Oval Office a few hours ago, seeking to calm a country obviously shaken by the worst terrorist attack suffered on U.S. soil in our country's history, vowing, in fact, to find those responsible for the attacks and bring them to justice. A fourth plane hijacked yesterday did not hit a building, as we said to you a few moments ago, but it did crash outside Pittsburgh, killing all 45 people on board. It was United Airlines Flight 93, and passenger Mark Bingham was able to call his mother on a cell phone from a locked bathroom to tell her that the plane was being hijacked. Bingham's mother, Alice Hoagland, spoke earlier with Peter Jennings.
He said, "I just wanted to let you know that I love you." He was repeating that same thing he had told Kathy a moment before. I told him, "We love you, Mark," and he said, "I'm on a flight, flight 93, United Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys that have taken over the flight, and they say they have a bomb. And I'm calling you from the airphone on the plane," meaning not his cell phone, I guess. I found out since that he was sitting in the last part of first class and that the flight was fairly light, not very many passengers, 45 people aboard. So he may well be able to take a proactive part in that, and they intended to do and target. I certainly hope so anyway.
Ms. Hoagland, I hate interviews like this at this moment, and I'm sure you are suffering in ways that we cannot imagine. Did your son say anything else to you about the circumstances on board the flight?
No, I wasn't able to. He was cut off. Can you hear me all right?
I can indeed.
The plane, the phone went dead after a few seconds. I got the impression that he was being distracted badly by something going on around him. I didn't hear anything except the sort of confusion. I didn't hear any explosions, any yelling, just voices, and then he seemed quite distracted about something. Quite calm voice, though. He was a very close fellow, and then he repeated that he loved us. He emphasized to me that what he was telling me was true. I told him I believed him, that we loved him, and the phone went dead.
Terrible, terrible news from the mother of Mark Bingham, one of the passengers on board one of the 4 commercial airline jets that were hijacked this morning. Several of those passengers on many of those airplanes were in fact able to use their cell phones. Many of them were reported on the phone when they called loved ones that they had been hijacked. Many of them had been herded to the back of the plane. They reported to loved ones that hijackers had in many cases attacked, stabbed flight attendants with knives that they had somehow managed to bring on board, something that is now going to be, the FBI will investigate investigate as a tremendous security breach. That later on, in one case, the pilot of the aircraft was taken to the back of the airplane, according to some reports, but several people were able to, in those terrifying moments when I'm sure they knew something very terrible was on its way to happening, were able to call somebody, loved ones, on their cell phone and talk with them. Well, after a day of virtual lockdown, the nation's capital does try to resume some of its normal activity today. ABC's Barry Serafin has been in Washington all evening. Barry, I know that we've already begun hearing calls for swift and severe retribution. What is the mood like on Capitol Hill among lawmakers and the White House administration?
I think the mood is the same at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, Elizabeth. It's grim, it's determined. There's certainly some simmering anger there. Congress later today is going to pass a resolution denouncing these acts, supporting the president. There's probably also going to be a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about better intelligence gathering by this country and probably about better airline security in this country.
In fact, there's been a lot of talk already on why on earth we didn't have any clue, apparently, that these attacks were going to happen. Something this well orchestrated took an enormous amount of planning and preparation by whoever is behind this attack. And there's already a lot of finger pointing going on about why we didn't get any sort of clue this was about to happen.
A lot of the intelligence professionals are saying the United States is the best in the world at technical intelligence gathering, scooping up information from the sky, in effect. But not so good nowadays in human intelligence, that is, people on the ground, informants on the ground. And I think that's going to be a lot of what you're hearing in coming days here.
And in fact, the way we fly in this country could change dramatically. Security, that sort of thing, the changes that could be happening at the airports?
Security is going to change once they resume flights, which could be as early as noon today. There's certainly, you won't be able to check in bags at curbside anymore. There's going to be a lot more security all along the way, including some random ID checks.
All right, Barry Serafin, thank you for checking in with us from our nation's capital, recapping the very latest on this unprecedented terrorist attack on the United States. A massive and grim search for survivors and bodies is underway in New York City after two hijacked jetliners, one an American Airlines jet, the other a United Airlines jet, slammed into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. The fires set off by the crashes eventually caused both of the 110-story towers to collapse. Officials fear as many as 300 firefighters may be among the casualties. They were apparently on the scene after the first jetliner crashed into the first tower, trying to evacuate people who are working in those buildings. And because they were there going in to rescue and to help people out, they too might have been victimized when the second jetliner crashed into, and then the second tower, and then when both towers eventually collapsed. But they say establishing a final death toll in this disaster at the World Trade Center location could take weeks. In the meantime, at the Pentagon, investigators fear hundreds of people were killed when another hijacked jetliner slammed into that building. The military is responding by putting its forces around the world on the very highest alert, and an aircraft carrier due to come home from the Persian Gulf has been ordered to remain in that area indefinitely. Obviously, the speculation being if there is any sort of retribution, any retaliation when we figure out who is behind the attack, perhaps that vessel will be in place for that. In an address from the Oval Office, President Bush said thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. He vowed to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. Indeed, we are already hearing quite a bit of talk from many people on Capitol Hill. Peter Jennings earlier this evening interviewing former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, vowing swift revenge, said this is war. It's been an act of war. You respond to war swiftly and severely. Here is some of what's happening around the country today. Congress and federal offices in the nation's capital will, in fact, be open this morning, as we've been hearing from our reporters on the scene, even as the Pentagon is on fire and the search for victims goes on. The Pentagon will, in fact, be open for business. However, the stock markets will be closed, and there will only be limited postal deliveries nationwide. Schools in both Washington and New York City have canceled classes for today, and all airline flights remain canceled canceled until at least noon Eastern time. The FAA apparently shutting everything down once it became clear that there was this orchestrated terrorist attack happening involving 4 hijacked jetliners, all in the span of about an hour yesterday morning, shutting down something it's never done, shutting down the entire country's airspace. For anyone seeking information on family members who may have been victims, a hotline has been set up. That number is 1-800-331-0075. You can call that to find out if anybody you know or care about is involved in this attack. And if you have any information on terrorist activity, you can go to the website set up by the FBI. That website is www.ifccfbi.com. You see that website, .gov, pardon me. www.ifccfbi.gov is the website the FBI has set up. We're going to go now to ABC's Bill Blakemore, who's been very close to ground zero for most of the evening down in lower Manhattan, where the devastation has been amazing. Rescue crews are working in impossible conditions trying to find survivors. Bill, any update, any more survivors found?
Not that we know of so far. The big problem is an enormous amount of dust and the fact that they still cannot get the fires out. We can see against the dark night sky the smoke coming from 2 of the large buildings that are just to the west of the trade towers. They've been burning all day. We were watching them burn from before noon today. They've tried to get up into the buildings next to them to get streams of water onto them. But they're still having an awful lot of trouble with that heat, and the heat also in the very center of the base of where the 2 trade towers were. You can probably see some of the smoke down at the end of the street, very often obscuring what little of the wreckage we can see from here, the twisted wreckage. But the search and rescue operations are beginning to move around the periphery. We're beginning to see some of the rubble moved out by front-end loaders in some of the trucks. And every couple of hours, another shift of firemen comes past us, completely covered with dust.
And Bill, how quickly was the city and the National Guard, I'm assuming or supposing, how quickly were they able to get all of those bulldozers and backhoes that are so necessary to move this massive amount of wreckage?
We saw that all accumulating by late afternoon. I haven't myself seen any of the National Guard yet, but by late afternoon there were dozens of fire trucks, these enormous pieces of heavy machinery like the front-end loaders coming on trailers, some of them. They were all in position here in these side streets out behind where the trade towers stood not so long ago. And at first there was a bit of traffic jam out here and real gridlock as the men in charge of coordinating all of this effort tried to figure out how to get things into position. But that's all been cleared up pretty much now. They closed down the city completely. There's also no electricity here except for the floodlights they've brought in, but there's certainly no civilian traffic here, so they finally have that under control. Of course, there's a very grim job ahead.
A grim job indeed, and it could be weeks. Thank you, Bill Blakemore, for that report down from lower Manhattan near ground zero of this disaster near the World Trade Center Twin Towers where they once stood. They say it could be weeks before we know the extent of the casualties, the extent of how many people killed and injured. The Navy's Atlantic Fleet has sent aircraft carriers, guided missile cruisers, and destroyers into the waters off New York City and Washington, D.C. The Navy has also deployed a warship to patrol off the coast of Seattle. ABC's Neil Karlinski is there.
In Seattle, a Navy frigate armed with anti-aircraft weapons steamed into position near downtown in Elliott Bay. Throughout this city, life as normal simply stopped.
They came on and said that they were evacuating and please leave immediately.
Downtown, several buildings were evacuated. Even the city's famous Space Needle was closed indefinitely for fear it too could be a target. Children were kept in school, but the day was anything but normal as the smallest of students tried to understand what was happening. On the water, ferry service, on alert for car bombs, stopped service to all but individual passengers.
I asked the American people to join me.
Many of those who saw the images before leaving for work this morning, like this woman, stayed home, disgusted by the pictures before them.
I just woke up to it. I mean, it's unbelievable. I can't believe it. I have so many friends in New York, and it's just...
It's going to be a couple minutes. We'll be over to help you, okay?
Others, desperate to help any way possible, simply flooded blood banks.
Because I had to do something.
You just feel so helpless, and this is about all you can do, is come and donate blood.
On the streets, churches opened their doors for people to do the only other thing many could immediately think of, pray. This man came in off the street.
Pearl Harbor pales in what's happened today.
There will be more prayers, blood donations, and help of all kinds in the days, weeks, and months to come. As in the rest of the country, no one knows when this city, so far from today's tragedy, will again return to normal. Neil Karlinski, ABC News, Seattle.
Thank you, Neil, for that report. We now have some home video, we are told, of the first plane hitting the first, you see it there, hitting the first tower at the World Trade Center. Cameras were, after this first explosion, cameras were trained on the Twin Towers when the second jet slammed into it. So that was the jet, the second, we've been seeing all day long, the second commercial jet slam into the second tower. That was just home video of the first one. We'll look at that one more time. You can see it heading straight for the tower. If we can re-rack that, please. Thank you. Home video just happened to be down there, happened to be rolling, and captured what is, even as we replay this, and we've seen this video twice. This video is the first time we're seeing this, but we've seen pictures, images of these jets crashing into the tower for hours now, and it is still an incredibly disturbing and upsetting sight to see. Again, those pictures just into our newsroom here of the very first wave of this unprecedented terrorist attack that has been launched here on the United States. We have been tracking this evening public reaction to the attacks throughout the day, and joining me now is ABC News polling director Gary Langer. What are you finding out as far as reaction? I mean, are people shaken? Obviously disturbed and upset.
I think so. Elizabeth, at times of crisis, Americans tend to express both concern and resolve alike, if you will, and I think we're seeing both of those now. Nearly 9 in 10 Americans are worried about the chance of more major terrorist attacks of this nature. Indeed, half the public is very worried about it. Nearly half worry that they personally could be the victim of this kind of attack, or someone close to them maybe. Now, despite these concerns, we find that about 2/3 express at least some confidence that the government can deter or prevent these kinds of attacks, and 2/3 also express a willingness to suspend some personal liberties in order to help the fight against terrorism.
That's an interesting one, because we've been talking already with some of our other reporters around Washington, D.C., for example, earlier to Lisa Stark out in Seattle, Washington, about the fact that this could change the way Americans fly. We've all become very accustomed to checking luggage at curbs and dashing in and out of airports. Could we be looking at something like El Al security, and is the American public willing to put up with that in massive inconvenience?
We do show some acceptance of that at this point, based in part upon concern over how this occurred. The public divides almost evenly on whether the authorities did all they reasonably could to prevent this or not. Now, nonetheless, now with this having happened, around 9 in 10 express at least some confidence that those responsible will be caught and punished. And also, we find that vast majorities, again, around 9 in 10 Americans, say they support military action against groups or nations found to be responsible, even if that means going to war.
It's interesting, that 91% figure, because in other cases of attacks, it actually hasn't been very easy for the United States government to figure out who was behind them and to bring those people to justice.
In this poll, even 54% are even very confident that those responsible can be found and caught. Now, there's some rallying around the flag there that you're going to find. There's broad concern and also resolve. Another interesting result, I think, is the remarkable extent to which these attacks have really focused the nation's attention. 99% of adults, basically everyone, have watched or listened to broadcast reports of this event. 91% say they prayed for the families or the victims. 4 in 10 employed people across the country left work early or didn't go to work today. Nearly 3 in 10 Americans, over 50 million people, say they called or emailed a friend or a relative relative in New York or Washington to see if they were okay.
Indeed, the frantic sort of reaching out to see if loved ones, people you care about, are in fact involved or may have been victimized in some way.
Completely across America.
It's so interesting to see yet again how something like this, a tragedy on this scale, really becomes a uniting factor for this country. People all over sort of sitting down watching and in horror as this all unfolded.
Quite remarkable how it is utterly and completely focused and commanded the nation's attention, and then created these really nearly unanimous views in terms of actions the government can and should take.
All right, Gary Langer, thanks for that polling data. We're going to very quickly update you as we take a look at some new pictures from this evening. For rescue workers, it's been another long and difficult day. They have converged by the dozens at the site of the World Trade Center to look for survivors and bodies amid the rubble of the Trade Center's twin towers. Both towers struck by two hijacked commercial jets, both towers collapsing a short time thereafter. Some 300 firefighters are believed among the victims. They were in the towers trying to evacuate them. Some 50,000 people work in those Trade Center towers every day. We don't know how many they were able to evacuate or not, but 300 firefighters we know were in the process of doing just that, and they are feared dead, killed, also victims in this. Officials say it could be weeks before we know the final death toll. Crews are also on the scene at the Pentagon, where another hijacked jetliner slammed into that building yesterday. There has been no credible claim of responsibility for the attacks orchestrated here in New York or in Washington, D.C. at this point. Whoever was behind it managed to pull off an incredibly well-orchestrated and devastatingly effective act of terrorism. But officials say suspected terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden is a prime suspect. We're going to go now to ABC's John Donvan for a look at how the entire day unfolded. Thanks.
Report in that there's been some sort of explosion.
The first thing any television camera saw this morning was this. It was just before 9. Roughly 15 minutes earlier, an American Airlines jet hijacked from Boston had crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. There were 92 people on board.
I was sort of at my desk working, general office activity, and felt an enormous, it almost felt like an earthquake, like I could literally feel and see things in the office moving and the floor moving. Immediately after it was some sort of explosion or something, there was an enormous volume of debris and paper. It almost looked like a dirty parade. All of this material just falling down.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Minutes later, the second plane, the second tower. The fireball ate up the aircraft. It was a United Airlines jet from Boston, 65 people on board.
As soon as he got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs burnt up. It's bad.
A big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
New York City was staggered, and still it wasn't over. Here in Washington, the Pentagon was now burning. Yet another hijacked aircraft, American Airlines Flight 77 with 64 on board, had crashed through the Pentagon's walls.
U.S. officials are saying there was no warning, no indicators of any kind of a likely terrorist attack. Number two, they say Pentagon officials within the intelligence and the counterterrorism offices are now looking at this very intensely.
Across Washington, ABC reporters were hearing officials use the word terrorism.
It seems obvious unofficially to people here that it was a terrorist attack, but they obviously can't reach any firm conclusions at this point. So the Pentagon is engaged, and I'm sure law enforcement is, but they say they had no warnings.
And around the nation's capital, a city full of potential targets, everyone was on edge.
Okay, there's been an explosion of some kind that shook the grounds of the Capitol. We all heard it. Everybody ran for cover. We don't know where it was. We don't see the smoke yet. Everybody's saying, get back. We're running, we're running, we're running.
This was the president this morning.
Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Mr. Bush was in Florida visiting a school. At the White House itself, everyone was evacuated. Then the whole federal government was evacuated, every federal worker. And in Washington, it was instant gridlock. Go! In New York City, meanwhile, they were also evacuating. And suddenly, the towers began to collapse in on themselves.
Why are they pulling us out of here?
Because the tower is leaning.
The north tower is leaning. Right, Marty, quick. Oh my God, there it goes!
I looked up as soon as we got across the street. I looked up, I saw the tower start to buckle. I just turned and ran, ducked down, put a jacket over my head. 3 or 4 of us huddled together, and it was just black everywhere.
And with everyone asking the obvious question, how in the world, answers will be coming in fragments.
The American Airlines Flight 11, the 767 from Boston to Los Angeles, a flight attendant called the American Airlines Operations Center to let them know that 2 flight attendants had been stabbed and the perpetrators had broken into the flight deck.
Then, just before lunchtime, in a green field in Pennsylvania, one final crash. A United Airlines 757 carrying 45 people from Newark to San Francisco. Reportedly, a passenger on board used his cell phone to call 911 before the plane went down. The president's safety had become an issue.
We flew for a couple of hours on Air Force One at what appeared to be a very high altitude. We were not told where we would land until the time came. There were jet fighters accompanying the president's aircraft. He has been traveling, we are told, by Ari Fleischer, and he will continue to travel.
Mr. Bush reached Washington earlier this evening. Already, we have these images that no one can ever forget. A tough guy mayor pained by what he saw.
The situation is that 2 airplanes have attacked apparently.
Can't go to sleep.
Why?
We should not go to sleep.
All right, well then let's go north then.
The dust, everywhere the dust. And how it just wouldn't come off. And the desperate choice by desperate people who had no way out.
We saw what we thought was debris, and we realized it was people jumping. I can't do anymore.
Late this afternoon, another building weakened by the blast went down like a domino. This evening, an address to the nation.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation.
At this point, it's hard to believe that all of this happened in a morning. Military jets are crisscrossing the skies over Manhattan. National Guard units are out. Washington is shut down. Airports in the U.S. and Canada are closed. And the death toll is still uncountable and unimaginable. John Donvan, ABC News, Washington.
Unimaginable indeed. ABC's John Donvan perfectly capturing the shock I think so many of us are still feeling, still reeling at the attacks that were launched this morning. There is an unbelievability to the fact that we in the United States find ourselves in this position. We do want to recap for you. This is ABC's continuing coverage of the terrorist attacks on the United States. We have a live look now at the site of the World Trade Center where rescue crews are working around the clock trying to reach bodies of survivors. Many are feared buried beneath the rubble of the Trade Center's twin towers. Both towers collapsed after two hijacked jetliners slammed into them early yesterday morning. You can see there the eerie sight down in lower Manhattan, the rubble, the dust, the wreckage, and the unimaginable body count, as I'm sure. And here we have the very first pictures of the first jetliner slamming into that first tower. This is home video. Somebody down in lower Manhattan just happened to be rolling when that happened, when the very first part of this multi-pronged terrorist attack occurred. And it is a devastating sight, an unbelievable sight to see a jet of that size. All four jets hijacked this morning were 757s or 767s, massive jets starting out on the East Coast, flying for destinations on the West Coast. We were told, or there's been speculation here, in fact, ABC's John Miller thought that perhaps that was a deliberate selection by the terrorists because those jets would have been full of jet fuel, making them extremely incendiary, extremely inflammatory, and extremely devastating. And that was at least a successful selection on the terrorist part. It is a similar scene of devastation tonight at the Pentagon, where another hijacked plane was attacked and crashed into the Pentagon yesterday. Officials fear hundreds of people there may have died. They were there for work in the morning. One wall of the Pentagon's 5 walls apparently has collapsed. The military is reacting by putting all of its forces around the world on the very highest state of alert. And as we've been saying to you, there is also going to be mobilization. We've got aircraft carriers moving to positions off the coast of New York City and Washington, D.C., as well as Seattle, Washington, standing by in case any other attacks will be launched, standing by, able to defend those cities and our country from whatever may happen. Despite the heavy damage at the Pentagon, it is scheduled to be open today, even as it burns and even as officials deal with what appears to be a large death toll there as well. ABC's Jim Sciutto is at the Pentagon. Jim, I understand there have been several not credible, incredible claims of responsibility, but there's been a new claim of responsibility that just came in a few moments ago that we're just learning about. Any credibility at all to this one?
Well, we've checked it out. Well, first let me tell you what it is. It's the Associated Press wires quoting foreign wire services saying that a Pakistan-based Islamic group fighting against Indian rule in the Kashmir, that, as you know, the disputed province between Pakistan and India, that this group called Lashkar-e-Taiba is claiming responsibility for the hijacking. But as you did mention, there have been many rumors. We've been in touch with the Joint Information Bureau of the Armed Forces as well as the Pentagon, both of them saying they know nothing of this.
And this is a Lashkar-e-Taiba, as you just said, a Pakistan-based Islamic militant group. Have they ever been responsible for any other forms of terrorism, or do we know what they might have accomplished in previous attempts?
No information beyond what I've said, and as I said, the Joint Information Bureau and the Pentagon saying they have no information about this.
And we should caution people as we say that they're, unfortunately, and after scenes of devastation like this, oftentimes terrorist groups are eager to claim responsibility for the terrible devastation, oftentimes many claiming responsibility when they had nothing, in fact, to do with the attack. Jim, the Pentagon is still burning at this hour?
It is still burning, still smoke coming out of the top, firefighters pouring water on the roof of the Pentagon. As I mentioned earlier, we saw flames breaking through about an hour ago. That's stopped now, but the fire chief here in Arlington, Virginia, where the Pentagon is located, saying they still don't have the fire under control and they want to get that fire under control before they continue the search and rescue and the recovery of victims as well.
How on earth is the Pentagon going to be open and on?